Right,
Okay, so I'm
you're
going to
on.
talk. I'm going to talk about Rokhl Korn, and I picked Rokhl Korn because in order to honor Shura Vaisman, whom I knew well, who was living here in the Washington area for a long time, and I was often at their home, and it was wonderful to get to know her. And so I wanted to pick to talk about Rokhl Korn in the spirit of Shura and her contribution to Yiddish across generations, because she was so active and she passed along her love of Yiddish to her daughter. And then the daughter clearly is passing it along to her daughter. So Rachel Korn was a feminist of a certain sort, in that she was, I guess, in the tradition of Glückel of Hamelin, really. She came from a very traditional family in a very rural part of Galicia. It was Austro-Hungary when she was born, and she lived amongst peasants, and her father died when she was very young, and she had the role model of a very strong mother. Um, let's start the PowerPoint, and we'll sort of take it from there. So um, I picked the title for this talk of Pious Jewish Mothers and Polish Peasants because she was very all embracing, and she came from this really sort of humble place in that her mother was a widow and managed an estate for a landowner, and she had a very strong role model. And so much happened in her lifetime. She lived through two world wars, and I'll tell you more about that in a little while. But she managed throughout to keep writing her poetry and short stories. She published 8 volumes, and she especially honored her mother, and her mother appears often in her poems. But I'll start first with a more humble example of something she wrote while still very young. Here she is as a girl in Galicia. She started publishing at the age of 19. She became very quickly known. She was, when World War I broke out, her family left the estate in Galicia to be in Vienna during the war years. And then after the war, she came back to Poland, but not to her village and rural roots, but to Przemysl. So let's move to the next slide. So this is a cassette I have of her. I think you can get this online somehow, but it's her reading her own poems. And I'm delighted throughout today to hear people using different dialects of Yiddish. Because she came from Galicia, of course, she spoke a Galicianish Yiddish. And because she was a lifelong smoker, her voice is quite raspy, but still a delight to hear. And I fell in love with her poetry. I was teaching Yiddish in Sweden for a Fulbright about 8 years ago, and I wanted to use poems that were written, Yiddish texts that came from Sweden for my students. And it turns out Rokhl Korn spent the years right after World War II in Stockholm, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later if I have time. Let's go further. So this is where she was after World War I. She was in Przemysl, and this map should be important for us today, sadly, because it's a war zone. The rivers. She was in Lemberg, Lviv when the Germans attacked in 1941 and had to flee eastward. And Przemysl is where she lived with her husband, who was a doctor, and they had a daughter. And she went between Przemysl and Warsaw and became part of the Yiddish literary scene and was quite a respected writer. So let's move to the next slide, please. So here again, a map of that general area in the Carpathian Mountains. The next one. While she and her daughter evacuated to from Galicia. Uh, they were well between 1939 and 1941. She stayed in Przemysl, and while she was there, the Yiddish Cultural Center happened to be in Kiev, and she published through the Kiev Yiddish Literary Group in that 2 year period. And then in 1941, she and her daughter fled eastward and she wound up in Uzbekistan. So I'll come to that again later. But here this says Sowjetisch Literarischer Almanach. And this I copied from the Montreal People's Library, which has her archive. If you're in Montreal, I recommend checking it out. Okay, weiter. Okay, so here's a poem she wrote while still quite young about the local Dorfs people, the village people. And it's about a mother in prison. So I'll just read the first verse. It's a very moving poem. And then I'll read the first verse in Yiddish. Had she been a lioness, a goat, or simply a cat, she would, with tooth and nail, have defended her young. But she, a poor village peasant, with her weary, calloused hand, her back hunched from heavy toil, goes to meet her son one last time, as two bayonets glint in the sun. Mama in Twisse, wollt sie gewinn a Leibeche, a Zeug, oder bloß a Katz, wollt sie mit Nägel und mit Zähn verteidigt ihre Kleine. Noch sie, Poierte, die Orme von Dorf, mit müde, abgearbeitete harte Hand, mit Plätzes eingehäukert von schwerer Mie, geht sie zu der letzten Sehung mit ihr Sohn und zwei Bagnetten finkeln in der Sonne. So she really had a deep understanding of the local peasantry and then also the world of nature. She was extremely fond of nature. She herself wound up in prison in as Poland became more Nazified, more anti-Semitic in the 1930s. She was part of a group of writers who were kind of leftish, fighting for rights, and she wound up in jail in Poland. And she wrote a wonderful poem about what the women were like in the prison and what it was like, even while she was there in 1937. She went home, and her main regret about going to prison was the worry that she had caused her. She was very close to her mother, and tragically, when she had to flee, she was separated. She couldn't, well, when Hitler attacked, she couldn't get to her old home, and her mother and her brother and everybody was on the other side of the border, and they worried about each other a great deal. Okay, next slide. Okay, so she was she and her daughter wound up in Uzbekistan. And she kept writing. All these poems come from a volume called Heim und Heimlosigkeit, Home and Homelessness, published in Buenos Aires in 1948. And I've translated a good deal of the poems, and I'm hoping to publish them in book form at some point. And here's one of my favorites. My mama Daventine. My mother is praying today, searching for traces of me in her old prayer book. Answer me, may God, with a light-hearted word, a year from today. Oh, answer her, my Lord. Oh, do not shame her in her loneliness, her misery. Reply to her through the grasses, through trees, through stars, because her cracked lips lead the Hebrew letters like dark, silent sheep to the wellspring of her tears. Mein Mama Daventant und sucht den alten Machzerl mein Spur. O entferrier, mein Gott, mit der leidselig Wort von Heint über ein Jahr. O entfert ihr mein Haar, ihr Einsamkeit, ihr Altkeit nicht verschämt. Entfert ihr durch Gras, durch Bäume, durch Stern. Bei Sphären ihre ausgezarte Lippen die Oisius, wie dunkle, stille Schepsen zum Qual von ihrer Tränen. So there she was in Uzbekistan, living in a clay hut and unable to communicate and not knowing what was going on with her mother. This is 1942, so nothing good was happening back in her mother's shtetl. And her mother, none of her family survived, only she and her daughter survived the war. She was separated from her husband, who tried to get to her but couldn't through because they had bombed out bridges and rail lines. Okay, next slide. So in the 1920s, she was part of a very liberated world in which women could have careers and did have careers. So she was often um, involved with her fellow poets and sometimes involved romantically. And this is a poem she wrote in 1947 after the war had ended and she was in Sweden. And during the post-war period and even during towards the end of the war, she felt an enormous weight of loss and of guilt. And this poem, To Mein Mann, speaks of their loyalty and yet the kinds of betrayals that had occurred earlier that they couldn't undo. So, like Jacob, you have sworn yourself to my fate for 3 times 7 years, and you watched over my days and my nights. Walk with me in my every footstep with all your heart. Okay. All right, next slide. Oh, is that it? Okay, no more slides. So,
No, that was a mistake.
oh,
Somehow
okay.
it unshared. Let me get back up.
Oh, ausgeschert. Abgeschert. Okay, I thought there was more. All right, so she survived the war in Uzbekistan and then Moscow. She spent 2 years in Moscow from 44 to 46. And there she had an opportunity to meet and spend time with the great Yiddish writers there, including Michoels, and Halkin, and all the others. And then she went back to Poland, found a ruined Poland, tried to look for family members and a world. And to her good luck, a Swedish prince had decided to hold a pen conference in 1946 in Stockholm, and they invited her to come to this conference. And so she got a visa and traveled to Stockholm and never returned to Poland. In Stockholm, she was there for 2 years, and she was part of a community of people other survivors who were in Sweden, some of whom had permission to stay on, many of whom didn't. And she wrote this very moving short story about waiting for a visa and trying to find a place to finally settle. In the spirit of women helping other women, Ida Maza from Montreal managed to wangle her a visa to come to Montreal. And in 1948, she went to Montreal and became part of the literary world of Yiddish Montreal. And that was the same year that I and my family wound up in Montreal from Europe. We were in Germany in a DP camp. And she gave talks at the very same library that I used to go to every day. And I wish I had known enough to go hear her, but I was a kid, so I didn't. But this is her passport to go to Sweden. So, anyway, next slide. Yeah. So, yeah, she when she was in the Soviet Union, she wrote something called Letter from Uzbekistan. And she wrote that the very skin of her hand was like an empty sack, her greatest dream, a loaf of bread. Um, so, this is just how much she went through. Some of her poems are so powerful because they describe the emotions. So many memoirs are about the facts. I was hungry, I traveled, I went here, I went there. But she really goes deeply into what it's like to be for days and weeks on a train that's filthy, that's smeared with feces, that's people have lice, and she really is not very pleasant, but she's very clever because she has this powerful voice, and at the same time she has a very sweet seductive voice. So she uses images of nature or beautiful imagery and draw you in, and then boom, she really hits you. So one of my favorite poems that I'm not including here, from 1944, when she was in Moscow, is called Revenge. And she really lays out graphically what she'd like to do to the enemies of her people. So, okay, next. All right. Yeah, keep going. Oh, yeah, she had issues with God, but I won't go into that here. It's interesting because she started out very much socialist, leftist, but came from an extremely traditional home. Her father was a Hebraic scholar. Her mother was very pious. Her grandmothers were pious. So very often she invokes the piety of the prior generations, but then has issues with a deity that allowed what happened to the Jews and to her mother especially to have happened. So here, my mother's footsteps were soft and pious, so that no sudden impact would trouble the muted soil. For perhaps in some far off, strange land it may have become a home for her child's bones. Mein Mammes Tritt ist still und fromm gewesen. Es soll kein harter Stell nicht wehtun, stummer Erd, was äscher dort in weiter unbekannter Fremd ist sie schon heimgeworden für ihr Kindsgebet. Okay. Okay, next. My mother's prayer is like a rainbow peering into every wrinkle of the sky through the highlights of her day, though the highlights of her days consist of drinking from the torrent of tears flowing from her eyes. Mein Mamas Twille ist wie a Regenbogen, was guckt rein in jeden Knetsch von Himmel, trotz stringt sich noch der Spitz von jeden ihrer Tag in Mabel Fleizen von ihre eigenen Augen. So the tears, like a Mabel, a flood, a torrent, but it makes the earth fertile. Okay, next. Es ist so enorm zu Gott. Es ist so, und Ness, es ist so enorm zu Gott und Ness, mein Mames Guf, wenn es liegt ihr Herz beim stillen Däufig von der Nacht. Tomer wird sich der Herren von der weiter weit, ihr Tochter schluchzt, ihr Nave nader Ruf. My mother's body is so near to God and miracles that when her heart lies within the soft pulsing of the night, she hears, even from afar, her daughter's sobs and a lonely wail. This whole period of her life, it must be a period of a good 10 years, she calls them her navenad, because she was homeless. The volume that she wrote, published in 48, is called Home and Homelessness, because she was wandering, she was surviving, she didn't have a home, but she was so rooted in her childhood home, in her mother's home, in the apple orchards, in the fertile land of Galicia. Imagine going from a fertile, forested, rich place to Uzbekistan's deserts. She was in a place called Fergana for a few years. Um, so this Navidad period is so painful for her because she doesn't know. She doesn't know what's happened back home. She doesn't know if her mother's alive or not. She worries about her mother, and she worries about her mother worrying about her. So, okay, weiter. Okay. Back there, all three clocks have stopped in case their ringing brings her to the edge of despair. Even the cricket falls silent till all the stars fall like weary tears into a net of the first rooster crowing. Denn in dort abgestellt die Segels alle drei, soll seier Klang nicht zuführen zum Sammebreg von Weh. Es schweigt die Grillafille, bis fallen alle Sterne wie müde Tränen in dem Netz von ersten Horngeschrei. So wonderfully rich imagery. I could do a whole book just on her references to birds. Okay, next one, please. Oh, yeah, so this is the survivor guilt one. To God, why do I deserve a quiet death with a pillow under my head? So this is after the war. And why do I deserve a quiet death with a pillow under my head, with a grave and a tombstone, where someday the roots of grasses will dutifully shape themselves around my bones? Every year, my mother, with pious and quiet demeanor, had beaten her breast, confessed her sins yet again, that she might be fated in his beloved name, to have a death after her confession and in her own bed. By taking upon herself sins she had never committed, she reached out to you on that fated day, whispering with pale, sorrowful lips, "O Lord, be merciful, I am ready." Why then did you so shame my mother's prayer, leaving the murderer to make a mockery of her body? Didn't the bullet that tore apart her heart, reach you in your own deepest depths? Apparently, my mother tried in her last hour to explain, to comprehend your vengeance, that you would have the right to join with all the dead who go around seeking their graves, like the homeless for a home. So, there again, we see homelessness and the search for home, even in her mother's ghost. So, her imagination was just going wild, trying to imagine and yet not imagine what had happened. Okay, next one. Okay, that's it. So I'm going to pause here, stop here. She had a long career in Canada after she left Sweden, and you can get the whole volume, Heim und Heimlosigkeit, from the National Yiddish Book Center website, and 1948. It's beautiful, um, and hopefully someday my translations will be published as well. And there's quite a bit that has been translated. Seymour Levitan has been very involved in translating her, but not enough. So let's any frages?
If you have a question, you can unmute yourself or raise your hand or put something in the chat, whatever you feel comfortable with.
And I have a sort of lingering thought that I've been sort of kicking around, not just with her poems, but with survivor memoirs in general. And maybe it's true of memoirs widely. There's certain things that come up again and again, and other things that don't. For example, there are many, many poems that reference her mother. There's only one poem that she writes to her daughter, even though her daughter was with her throughout. Um, and it's really quite a powerful one. Seymour Levitan translated this one. She wrote it in Moscow in 1944 to my daughter. When I led you out, the earth spurted blood and terror with every step we took. The greatest good was sudden death and a mother's blessing, the sure mercy of a bullet for her child. So her daughter was grown. Her daughter was studying medicine in Lemberg, Lviv, Lvov in 1941, and she happened to be visiting her daughter when the Germans attacked Russia, and they were evacuated along with many, many other people. And the daughter wound up marrying and in Russia, and did become a doctor, studied in Sweden a bit, and then had a long, I don't know much about the daughter. But there's certain things that come up again and again in memoirs that are deeply, deeply personal, and then other things just don't come up or are referred to so obliquely. I translated Shimon Jigan's memoir, and he tells you so many things about his life. He never mentions his mother. We don't know if he had brothers or sisters. How can you leave that out? But there we are. He didn't. He chose. There's a certain kind of editing that happens. I suppose it's true of all of us when we look back at our lives. Certain things maybe come up again and again or not. She was, by the way, when she was in the Soviet Union, I went to Gennady Estreich's wonderful talk earlier today, and she did publish in a publication called Einigkeit that was put out by the Anti-Fascist Committee. So she was part of that propaganda machine while she was there, and but, it was very in her archive in Montreal, there's a whole manuscript that nobody's really translated yet, devoted to the Soviet Yiddish writers. I hope someday somebody picks that up. I, I don't have that much time. So, Fagus,
I have ik heb een vraag, Miriam.
good. Okay.
Did she, I have twee vragen.
Okay.
Did she ever write prose?
Oh,
And
yes. Yes.
she did.
Yes, she did. In fact,
Memoirs?
no, no, fiction, but they're you can see they're close enough to her reality. So I have most of them have not been translated. A few have been in various anthologies of Yiddish women writers, um, but there's more, and I have a whole volume of her short stories that. Yeah, she didn't write any novels, but because her life was rather disrupted, as you can tell. And she was amazing. She just kept going. I loved working in her archives at the Montreal Jewish Library because you can see, the letters, the correspondences, the contacts. It was a community of people who knew each other from before the war. Melech Ravitch figured largely in there, and she was amazing and meticulous, editing every line with a very nice little handschrift. Clearly, yeah, devoted. So did I answer those two questions? What was the other one?
Yeah, the other question is, I'm interested in what Yiddish education she received. You said she published for the first time already at the age of 19.
Thank you for asking that because she began in her girlhood. She was educated in Poland. She had a tutor. She lived not even in a village, but out in the country. So they brought in a tutor, and because of the tradition, she would have spoken Yiddish at home, been able to communicate with locals in Polish and Ukrainian, probably both, because most of Galicia was like a third, a third, a third. So the peasants tended to be Ukrainians. And she then was sent to a nearby village to study in a school, to go to Cheder. So she would have known enough to pray from a machzor and a siddur, but she never was inclined towards Zionism or Hebrew. But she did initially write in Polish, and then in 1919 she switched to Yiddish because there was a lot of anti-Semitism by the Poles, and that sort of inspired a lot of people who might have been um, anchored to Polish culture to acknowledge in a way their own culture. And also in 1919, it was the move from Vienna to Przemysl, which is a bigger place. And there her husband also encouraged her to write in Yiddish. And in Yiddish, she had literary outlets, there were journals, there were colleagues, there was a whole world to support Yiddish writers. And also, it was a time of belief in equality of women, Freie Liebe and women's rights and all that. The 1920s, that was blossoming, and she was part of that generation. So she continued to write in Yiddish the rest of her life. And in a way, you can see how that's good because wherever she was, she could write and have a readership in Yiddish. It's really hard to learn Uzbek when you're 40, Did that answer your question?
Yes, dank.
Dank.
Ich habe eine Frage.
Ja.
Ich bin nicht sicher, was es meint, Navenader Ruf.
Oh, Navinad. Yeah, Navinad is wandering, but sad and wandering, not like the German romantics, dreaming of clouds, but like, I wish I had a home. I wish the world were a better place. Yeah, that Navinad. And Ruf is the call, right?
Ruf, ich weiß, ja.
Yeah.
Okay.
Nog vragen? Ich will wissen, Sie erkennen Ihre Lieder schon von früher. I'm sorry, I'm speaking Yiddish. Do any of you know her poetry from before? Do you have any favorites?
Nee, aber ich habe de Buch von Sheva Zucca.
Okay.
In a Gruppe, wir lernen in alle. Und wir haben nicht, we didn't yet get to Rokhl Korn, but we will. And I'm looking forward to reading it. Yeah.
And Michael has very nicely put in chat a better translation of Navinat. So vagabond is one of the English. With languages, you sort of have an approximation. You can never especially the things like Navinad. It summons up emotions that don't necessarily translate. Okay, anybody else have memories of reading Rokhl Korn or know about her? Maybe I should read something else. Oh yeah, I know. So if I can find it quickly. So when Lemberg was bombed, now I have to look it up. When Lemberg was bombed, he wrote a cycle of 3 poems that describe the destruction of the synagogue. And it's called Aufchurves. And she describes that this burnt, hollowed out synagogue, and the pillars of the synagogue are sort of tapping their way around like blind beggars. And then she goes from that poem to describe the city bombed out and cats and dogs running around in the stones and rubble. And then the third poem is called Das letzte Hemd, the last shirt. And it's about this man who is selling his last shirt. And he's sort of shy, he's embarrassed. So he's standing in an alleyway, bare chested, as customers come and feel and touch the shirt. And then a wind comes and blows up the sleeves of the shirt and they wrap themselves around his neck. So it's like this cycle of three poems called Oifchurves. Churves is like ruins. And then there's a wonderful poem about cranes. I was talking about birds. So she's separated from her parents, from her mother, from her brother and his children, and she writes about 2 cranes that are flying from where she is towards her home, and they're flying over rooftops and they're flying over ruins and so they can get to her home, but she can't. And then towards the end, when she was, and this was published actually in Pakenträger, if you go into Pakenträger and type in either my name or Rokhl Korn, you'll find quite a few of my translations appear there. And one of my favorite ones is about an owl, the Sove. And she wrote this while she was in Sweden, and she was wishing that she had been an owl. She could become an owl to go back to her old home and warn the Jews about danger to come. So she's kind of tapping into a local mythology of birds that she uses descriptively to sort of touch emotions that are very local. So yeah, and another one is Exodus 1947 that was published in the Pakenträger, where she describes the survivors clinging to this ship trying to get to Palestine. So those are some memorable poems from my translations. Yeah, you can't hear it because I don't have enough time now, but you can read them in the original if your Yiddish is good enough. Just go and get the book from, it's called Heim und Heimlosigkeit from the National Yiddish Book Center website. Just type in Rokhl Korn and it'll pop up. It's amazing. It's just such a treasure. Okay, noch any last minute, we have 4 minutes left. Last minute comments, questions?
Like Susan Gantz has her hand up.
What's my favorite Rokhl Korn poem? Oh, shoot, that's so hard.
I have a poem that I like. Von jener Zeit Lied.
Yes, that's
Read
the
a
best
verse.
known. That's the best known one, and that's
Right.
been translated and published. And yeah, and I love them all. You know,
If it's okay, I would read one verse.
let's not, because we only have 3
Oh,
minutes,
okay.
and I want to give other people a chance to have a question or a word. Yeah.
It's
So
in this
anyway,
book.
yeah, the Penguin, well, yeah, of modern Yiddish verse. So that, there in that poem, again, the mother, is at the
Yes.
far end. It's mother, it's home, it's nature. It's incredible. While she was in Uzbekistan, she wrote this poem about Genghis Khan that I just love. But she's not allowed to write about Stalin or Hitler in that time. But she could write about Genghis Khan. And when you read her writing about Genghis Khan, you realize she really means Stalin or Hitler. She's just, yeah, Nye Clade is also wonderful. Yeah, she's just, each one is like a treasure. And I'm very lucky. I actually was translating her poems at first literally for my students, and I fell in love with them. And so I decided to do a better job. And I hope I do her justice. With poetry, it's very difficult. I couldn't keep, I had to choose between rhyme and meter and imagery, and I opted for the imagery at the expense of rhyme. But those are the choices. So I want to thank you all for coming, and I wish you a wonderful rest of the afternoon. What a great conference this is. And herzlichen Dank euch alle. Miri, it's so good to see you. And yeah, seid gesehen. Michael, thank you so much for all your help with this.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Okay.